Thank you very much, Duncan. It's, as always, a real pleasure to be back in Australia. Some of you may know that I lived and worked here many years ago and have come back many times since, and it's a real pleasure to be back here in Sydney. One of the last times I was there, the test match happened to be on at the same time, which does make life as an Englishman in this country a little difficult at the time, but this is not the case on this particular occasion. The task I was asked to try and address was in a way to be a little provocative, to try and say, what are some of the issues that we still need to know much more about, but really in a way to try and think about how we bring together the vast amount of knowledge that is developing around Prader-Willi syndrome. And I'm going to argue that I think one of the challenges is that we don't really have what I might call a theory of Prader-Willi syndrome as yet. We can't really quite link what is happening at the level of the genes to what is happening in the brain to what you see and observe in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. We recognize that people living with Prader-Willi syndrome vary enormously both in personality and in their skills and in the extent and nature of the problems that they have. But there are, of course, certain core features of Prader-Willi syndrome that require an explanation. And it's these features, such as hyperphagia, that we're really looking to develop treatments for. And this is a really exciting time because I think we are this close to some really important developments that have the potential to transform the lives of people with the syndrome. So I'm going to attempt to provide what I've called a very personal and clinical perspective on Prader-Willi syndrome. It's a perspective of myself as a psychiatrist. People in the audience may disagree with what I have to say. At some level, that doesn't matter. It challenges people to think about the issues. And I'm doing this as a clinician, not a basic scientist. And what I want to do is really try and say, look, there are certain observations that have been made from a clinical point of view that can transform our thinking about Prader-Willi syndrome, really lead to a step change. And I hope I'm going to be able to illustrate that to you. And as a result of those observations, I think we are getting closer to developing what I call a sort of theory of Prader-Willi syndrome. Now, I'm going to put to you some propositions which you may or may not agree with. But first, that I think that one of the changes is that whilst we talk about Prader-Willi syndrome as being a multi-system disorder, and clearly the spine may be affected and so on and so forth, fundamentally, Prader-Willi syndrome is a syndrome in which there is impairment in terms of brain development, and that many of these other features are secondary to that brain impairment. So the question that we have to try and ask ourselves is, why is it that the brain develops in an atypical way in people with Prader-Willi syndrome? Secondly, I'm going to try and argue that the neuropsychiatric and cognitive phenotype associated with Prader-Willi syndrome is a consequence of a particular pattern of atypical brain development that is specific but not unique to Prader-Willi syndrome. And of course, that results from the absence of expression of maternally imprinted gene or genes located at 15q11-13, something we're very familiar with. And finally, I'm going to try and argue, and I propose that when you focus down and think about behaviors of concern, such as the temper outbursts, for example, that one recognizes that these are shaped by and arise as a consequence, on the one hand, of this impairment of brain development and the problems that, if you like, the brain has in responding to changes and demands in the environment, in the context of the changing environment. And that the way we might think about is around this idea of homeostasis. And here, the next slide gives you a quote from the work of Antonio Damasio, a very eminent neuroscientist, because for me, that made me think that behavior is much about homeostasis as the traditional areas we think about, such as temperature regulation or whatever it happens to be. And you'll see from this quote that he talks about feelings are mental experiences of bodily states. Now, because they're mental experiences, they're conscious, they must in some way be represented in the cortex and the surface of the brain, and I'll come back to that. But, you know, in a sense, I think all good papers will tell you something that at one level, once you've read it, you realize is fairly obvious. But, hunger is a conscious experience. It is telling us that we need to eat for energy to maintain the body. Pain is a conscious experience to tell us that there's potentially something harmful happening to us. Anxiety is a conscious experience to tell us that maybe we're in a situation that we know we're at risk and we need to do something about. But the point he then goes on to say is that these have neural substrates to them. And therefore, we ought to be able to tease out these feelings by using the more advanced brain scanning techniques that are coming through, so that we can ask ourselves, where are such feelings represented in the brain, and how is that different in someone with Prader-Willi syndrome? And ultimately, we can ask ourselves, how is it that a treatment might change, improve that, or normalize that situation? And it's those sorts of things that I want to try and illustrate to you by both looking at how hyperphagia and our understanding of hyperphagia has changed over time, looking at the temper outbursts and trying to better understand that. And if there's time, look at the risk of psychotic illness. But I want to, I have to look at this, my notes here, because it's a bit difficult just to see the slide. So that's why I'm looking down here. Just takes me back to the first study that I was ever involved with in Prader-Willi syndrome, and the first person I ever saw with Prader-Willi syndrome. And her weight chart is shown on the top left-hand corner here, and that showed how much weight she put on when, as a young woman aged 18, she left the family home where the kitchen was locked, and she moved into a hostel where she had complete independence. And the family said, "You can't do that, this is what will happen." And sure enough, this happened. And I was asked to see her as a trainee psychiatrist in London at that time. I'd never heard of Prader-Willi syndrome, but that started me on my involvement in Prader-Willi syndrome over the years. And then the bottom left showed we then did our first study of Prader-Willi syndrome. We looked at rate of eating when you had an hour's access to food. This is a control group in the bottom left. And the middle at the top is a group of 13 people with Prader-Willi syndrome. None of this would be surprising to you. It shows how much they ate. But the top right shows ratings of hunger. And this is where Damasio's work, now for me puts it in context. I put there the mental experiences of bodily states, hunger in this case. And we asked the people involved in this study to rate their hunger on a 10 centimeter scale, as hungry as I've ever felt, not at all hungry, and to do that at 20-minute intervals as they ate food. And of course, what was striking about was not only was the people with Prader-Willi syndrome, by and large, most of them continued to eat, but what was in a way unexpected is they did satiate. They did reduce their hunger time and rate themselves as being less hungry, but they started at a higher level. It took them longer to lose their sense of hunger, and it bounced back up more quickly. But they had to eat 3 times more calories to satiate than the typically developing group did. And what that told us at the time was that it wasn't that the satiety process was absent, it was insensitive. And I'll come back to that because I think that for me was a really important observation, largely because I think it suggests it's tractable, it's treatable. If it was absent completely, you have a problem in a genetic condition. But it wasn't absent. It was there, but it was insensitive. We then went on, when I moved to Cambridge, to do our first neuroimaging study of Prader-Willi syndrome. And I want to draw your attention to the top right graph there. What we did, part of the experiment, and there's a whole number of stages to it, was that we scanned people with Prader-Willi syndrome and a control group when they came in having not eaten overnight, so they were starving. We scanned them, asking them to look at pictures and make choices about food. We then gave them a disguised, very high-calorie load, a 1,200 calorie meal, and I tried eating it. It was a sort of porridge, and I couldn't, and I have a good appetite. It switched my hunger off very quickly. And we asked them whilst they were doing that again to rate their hunger whilst they were eating. And what we found is that some people with Prader-Willi syndrome didn't shift at all. And they're the people, the dots on the lower part of the graph, on the left side of the graph. They didn't shift. The vertical thing shows the percentage shift between having not eaten and having eaten the 1,200 calorie meal. But the ones on the right did shift their ratings of hunger, again showing that it was insensitive, not absent. And then what we found is, in fact, those that shifted also shifted the activation pattern in the brain. So this goes back to Damasio's work again. It shows that there are neural substrates in the brain for hunger, and if people lose their hunger and become full, those neural substrates change. And I think this has been very important, and now we're following this up with further studies. So again, just to emphasize, this suggested to me that the problem was tractable. But then, and for me, this changed the way I thought about hyperphagia in Prader-Willi syndrome. And this was a study by Stephanie Brown. She's a neuroimager in Cambridge who was originally working on our work on Down syndrome and dementia. But one day she came in, she said, we've discovered, or there's a way of now imaging the hypothalamus, which all of you know how critically important that is. And that hadn't been possible until then. And I said to her, you must do it in Prader-Willi syndrome. And we had the scans already. And in a way, like I think good research, it shows the afterwards, you say, well, why didn't we think of this before, in a way? And she showed that the hypothalamus was significantly smaller in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. This was young adults she had scanned, compared to same age, typically developing group, and compared to a group of people who had obesity for no other reason. And she also showed that the smaller the hypothalamus, the greater the BMI, the weight, and also the greater the level of hyperphagia was on the uneating disorder scale. Now, the reason that's important is that for me, that changed the perspective. It says, actually, the question we need to answer is, why do the genetics of Prader-Willi syndrome lead to impaired development of the hypothalamus? Because once you've got impaired development of the hypothalamus, so much else you can understand about Prader-Willi syndrome, the growth hormone, sex hormone deficiencies, the temperature irregularities, as well as the hyperphagia. Sorry, I'll just go back. So I think, in summary at this point, in Prader-Willi syndrome, there's an impaired behavioral and neural response, but not an absent response to food intake. So the question is hyperphagia explained solely by the small hypothalamus, or are there still other processes that are going on? But for me, it changes the emphasis that you place, and the question you're trying to answer is, why is the hypothalamus not developing normally? Now, I want to do the same sort of thing with emotional outbursts. I want to try and demonstrate to you how a single observation can change your perspective about it and raise new questions that then need to be answered. So I'm going to look very briefly at the characteristics, how we might think about some of the causative mechanisms and the sort of interventions. The first thing to say is that one aspect that has been very well recognized is the cognitive impairments that may be associated with having Prader-Willi syndrome. And many of those are about fairly advanced cognitive processes, such as the idea of theory of mind and planning and that sort of thing. And therefore a recognition that, of course, as someone with Prader-Willi syndrome gets older and moves into the adult world, in a way, the adult world becomes a real challenge for them. And that much of the behavior that can be seen is the fact that they don't necessarily have the full cognitive abilities to deal with those challenges, particularly as they get older and perhaps have more independence. So that has been part of the thinking, and the approach has been, how can you change the environment so that you can mitigate against some of the problems associated with having these cognitive deficits? But this is the observation that, for me, changed the way I thought about it. We had done a study of vagus nerve stimulation using implanted stimulators. Just 3 people with Prader-Willi syndrome volunteered. And the thinking then was this might be a way of modifying the hyperphagia, because the vagus nerve is a part of the feedback mechanism. It didn't help the hyperphagia, but 2 of the 3 people who had serious behavior problems came to us after a while and said, but it's transformed our behavior. It stopped the tempers. It's made life so much better. And we then went on to do a second study, and this time we were able to use external stimulators that people wore 4 hours a day. And you can see the graph at the bottom. 5 out of 6 people who took part in the study completed it. 4 of those, their behavioral outbursts diminished over a period of time in a quite dramatic way. And clearly, speaking to them and their families, it changed their life. And I hope you can read it, or some of you at the front, at least some of the quotes here. Before, you couldn't challenge him on certain things, but now you can. And he's prepared to sit and listen. Something that I think, certainly for the parents here, that's a remarkable thing to have happened. And now FPWR in the States have funded a large trial of vagus nerve stimulation, and Deepan Singh, who will be speaking later, is the principal investigator on that trial. So that's an example, I think, of how you change perspective. So now, if you look at temper outbursts in Prader-Willi syndrome, I think we have a good understanding through work of Lauren Rice here, Kate Woodcock in Birmingham, about the nature and characteristics of the temper outbursts in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. I think the concepts of what's called applied behavioral analysis, about how these behaviors are shaped by what happens in the environment, is still an important concept, and that's illustrated on the right-hand side of the graph. I've put Damasio's quotes, if you like, down on the bottom left about mental experiences of bodily states. In this case, maybe in response to a risk of harm or something like that. But the bit that's changed for me is this middle bit here, the balance. That what vagus nerve stimulation and how it improved behavior suggested to me was the importance of the autonomic nervous system. And whilst that's always been recognized in Prader-Willi syndrome, I don't think it had enough status. And it seemed to us that what was driving this risk of temper outbursts was this imbalance of the autonomic nervous system. And vagus nerve stimulation, which is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, was sort of correcting that. Now, I want to end. I hope if there's time, go to the psychosis story, but I just want to say the importance of trying to link the Prader-Willi work with some of the amazing work that's going on in cognitive neurosciences. And this is one example of that, is that 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. I think I'll be in time. Otherwise, that noise will come. And I think, but I think for me, it's really helpful to think about these things. So there's this whole idea that the way we humans survive and operate within the challenging environments that we live is that our brain develops and maintains a model of both the external world and the internal world. So, it's a state of hunger, but also what is going on around us. Clearly, it would be too computationally demanding to constantly revisit that. So what the brain is doing through our senses is looking for change. And it evaluates that change. So, in the days of hunting, it may be a noise in the bush. And is that potential food, or is that a potential predator, someone we should be wary of? And that's essentially how the brain, if in a sense, operates. And the problem for people with Prader-Willi syndrome are really twofold. One is that cognitively, they are less able to evaluate what is going on around. So less able to appreciate whether someone is a friend or a foe, for example. And therefore, they live in this rather uncertain and uncomfortable world. And I think for me, that helps to explain some of the anxieties that are reported in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. But the important thing is that really neuropsychological deficits or difficulties are seen as false inferences that arise due to aberrant inputs and are a poor fit for the real world. So in other words, again, this is part of homeostasis. Their evaluation of the world is incomplete, and therefore they respond inappropriately maybe excessively, or it may be not at all, but they respond inappropriately. And I think that's a really important way of looking at it. And you can sort of try and summarize that in terms of the input that they're getting from their body about things like hunger and temperature, and the things they're getting from the environment, like what's going on around them, that their model that they hold in their brain is, as I say, incomplete and therefore problematic for them. So what are the implications of these sorts of observations? I think, firstly, that the main driver for the outburst is this propensity to impaired emotional regulation in response to what you might call threat. And then there's an interesting question: to what extent is there a common mechanism linking the hyperphagia, the emotional outbursts, and anxiousness? And I think we need more work to look at biomarkers for that. And in a paper called The Paradox of Prader-Willi Syndrome Revisited, which was our second paper around this, we raised the idea that people with Prader-Willi syndrome live in this, what we call hunting mode. As they're hungry, they are always looking for food, and that raises them, makes them more anxious, makes them a little more closer to the edge for an outburst. And my prediction is that when you find a drug that treats the hyperphagia, it will also help the other behaviors. And DCCR are reporting some benefits to behavior. But I think, there's some really important observations still to be made about this. Finally, this is just our work on psychosis. And I really want to emphasize here, psychosis is a treatable condition. It's treatable. And so you must recognize it and then treat it and see it properly for what it is. So I know for families that have children with disomy, which is the group at risk, particularly at risk for psychosis, they worry about it, but it is treatable. And that's really important. But just to say, the key issue here was the fact that it's more in the disomy, which suggests it's not Prader-Willi syndrome per se that is giving you this increase for psychosis. It is having disomy. And that raises questions about what's the genetic basis for that. It's not the genetic basis of Prader-Willi syndrome. It's what makes UPD different, the genetics of UPD that's different from the genetics of deletion. And that suggests that some of the genes of the opposite imprint, such as UBE3A, which is important in Angelman syndrome, may be important because people with UPD have a double dose of that gene. Now, because of time, I will move on and just end with this slide to try and sort of bring these bits together. So let me just get my notes here so that I can remind myself what I've actually said there. So first of all, I think we must think of Prader-Willi syndrome as a developmental disorder, and there's this whole question about why the hypothalamus doesn't develop normally. There's also the whole question of why the genes, whose absence of expression gives rise to Prader-Willi syndrome, have through evolution become imprinted. And that, we've never asked ourselves properly that question. And there's something called kinship theory, which I think is a very potentially important explanation. And for us, we're looking more and more at the placenta and the gene expression there and how that might set the scene for the future development of hyperphagia. I think, well, I've talked a lot about the temper outbursts and things, and what's often referred to as the polyvagal theory. And I think ultimately understanding of psychosis is about understanding the difference at the level of the brain between UPD and deletion. A number of acknowledgements. This work only takes place in the context of people with remarkable and wonderful skills, knowledge, some of my consultancy and potential conflicts there. And finally, just to tell you all that the next IPWSO conference will be taking place in America, and it's a collaborative conference between PWSA USA, FPWR, and IPWSO, and it would be really nice to see you all there. Okay. Thank you.
My natural instinct is to start asking questions. I felt terrible kind of putting pressure on you, Tony. Simple takeaway for me is, as we discussed last night, genetics, the body, the mind, incomplete information means you react in what may be a rational way, inconsistent with the world around you, and who knows what the implications of that are over time. we'll be able to ask some questions later on. We've got to move on, right, Kath?